Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second Audit Committee Forum for 2022. For those of you who are new to this, we're trying to run these twice a year at least, and to communicate to you matters that we think are of importance, but also to have an exchange with you. So for those of you who, as I said, are new to this, the format today will be I'll give a short presentation, I'll take some questions and answers, so there's a Q&A function, so feel free to submit questions as they occur to you, and they'll be followed by Roberta Skliros, who's the Assistant Auditor-General Financial Audit, who will then also be able to respond to any questions that may arise from her presentation, but also, I think importantly, we're here to answer any other questions you may have that may occur to you during the presentation, not even necessarily related to the presentation. So before I get underway with my presentation, I'd like to, as we always do, acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which we meet today. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and also to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are with us today, in fact, to any First Nations peoples. Okay, I think I'm ready to start presenting. I hope my content's up there, so we'll see how we go. I've just, my presentation is covering some work we're doing in the office at the moment on trying to analyse and understand the performance audit recommendations we've made over the last 5 years or so of my term. And it occurred to us that one way we could analyse these recommendations was to see how they fitted into the internal control framework, which is a feature, at least of the state government, of the standing directions, and a requirement, in fact, for organisations to implement the internal control framework. So I wanted to take you through this against the framework of internal control. But I'd like to start, and only because, well, not only because, but most recently I've just come back yesterday from the Australian Public Sector Anti-Corruption Conference that was held in Sydney over the last 3 days, where all the anti-corruption state and territory bodies, and of course a lot of excitement about the National Anti-Corruption Commission that is in prospect. There's an expectation that the NAC, the NACC, will be established by about the middle of next year. There was a lot of conversation there about corruption, as you can imagine, given the theme of the conference, and there were a number of case studies and some of the significant reports that have been put out, including by our own IBAC here. And as I was reflecting on the presentations, I keep coming back to this slide, which I like to throw up at just about all my presentations, which is one, to situate the various roles of the 3 integrity officers of Parliament, but also, and this is probably more importantly, to talk about what I think integrity means. And this was discussed during the conference, because people were asked, you know, how do you get, what's integrity look like in your organisation, you know, and how do you ensure there's integrity? And a lot of the conversation and the focus was, well, you know, integrity is the absence of corruption, and that's fair enough. That is one way to look at integrity, in that sense, of a negative sense, that it's an absence of corruption. I like to think that integrity is more than that, and I like to think that as public servants, if we want to demonstrate that we're acting with integrity, not only should we be free from corruption, but we should also be making sure that our operations are efficient and effective and economical and compliant with the law. So I see integrity as a positive obligation, not just not to do wrong, but actually to do right in terms of your organisational objectives. And if you can answer that question, you know, that I am satisfied that we are operating efficiently, effectively, economically and in compliance with the laws, then you can probably say, well, we're acting and behaving with integrity. Whether you agree with that or not, if we come to the concept of internal control, and again reflecting on some of the presentations at the conference, it occurred to me that a lot of these well celebrated and publicised cases of fraud and corruption in the public sector here in Victoria and New South Wales and Western Australia, that there was a failure of internal control that allowed these things to happen. So it's really important not just to have a good internal control system to prevent, if you like, corruption, or to detect it and properly investigate it and report on it. But it's also good to have an internal control system which is going to get you efficient and effective in economic operations. So this is the COSO internal control framework. I'm sure many of you as Audit Committee members are familiar with it, and I would hope at the state government you are. As I said, it's actually embedded, if you like, and written into the requirements under the standing directions, and this framework is discussed in the guidelines that support those. Some of you who haven't got that financial or audit background may not be aware of this model, so I commend that to you, and some of you may be new committee members. For those of you who've been around for a while, you probably can tune out a little bit now, but I think it's worthwhile just reiterating what this framework's about and how it could be applied in the context of internal audit. So there's kind of three parts of the framework, and the first concept, if you like, is the objectives of internal control. And I've just alluded to one of the objectives of internal control, which is to ensure that you have efficient and effective operations. So that's the operational objective that attends to internal control. There are also the ones that you'd be most familiar with through the work of my office in terms of financial audit, the objective of reliable internal and external reporting. And that's a key feature of an internal control system as it goes to your financial reports and your performance reports if you produce those, and any other documentation you put out in the public domain. And then, of course, the third objective, if you like, of an internal control system is to have compliant operations, to comply with laws and regulations and other requirements of government. So that's the first lens to look through, the kind of three objectives of internal control. And they can apply across your entire organisation, they can apply within organisational units. And then we take what are the dimensions, if you like, or the components. How do we think about the organisation from a control perspective rather than the functions that are performed or the organisational structures? And this model's been around since about 1990, so it's a very mature model, very robust model, and I commend it to you if you're not aware of it. So it breaks it into these 5 components: the control environment, as it says there, risk assessment, control activities, information and monitoring activities. Now, the focus of these components is around internal control again. And the control environment is kind of the pervasive environment that you establish within your organisation to make sure that internal controls at the activity level are likely to operate effectively and as management intends them to be. But the centre of this is your control activities, and those control activities are those specific things you put in place to mitigate risks. Risks to efficient and effective operations, risks to reliable financial reporting and compliance risks. But it presupposes that you've done a risk assessment. So we don't create control activities in the absence of understanding what the risks are that we're trying to mitigate, how significant and serious those risks are, so we can get a proportionate response in terms of the controls that we put in place and embed. And information and communication kind of covers a couple of areas. One of the key focuses of this framework is talking about information and communication within the organisation about internal control. If you're going to have an effective control framework, people have to understand their roles and responsibilities and the controls that exist within and operate within the organisation. And it also talks about getting external information into your organisation about your internal control. So that could be, for example, analysing complaints that are coming in about your organisation's operations or functions or compliance. But I think it's more broadly than that. I look at the information and communication also in terms of the systems that you've set up, the information systems you've set up to understand your operations more broadly. And then we have these monitoring activities. And of course, as Audit and Risk Committee members, the monitoring activities you're most familiar with would be internal audit, the third line of defence. And these are the activities that monitor the internal control framework itself. So they form a part of internal control, but what they're there to do is to monitor the rest of the framework. So internal audit, but of course there can be management self-assessment in that equation, and of course there can be external audit and other external evaluations that are undertaken to understand how effective your internal controls are. So they're the 5 elements of the control structure. And again, if you're interested in this, not just in the standing directions and the guidelines, but there's a lot of literature out there about these components and how they operate. And then within that, within each component, there are a series of principles around internal control that are espoused through the framework. And this slide, I won't go through all the principles, but it gives you a sense of how there's this hierarchical approach to understanding internal control. And you know, the number one, and again, I guess it was a big feature at the APSAC conference over the last 2 days. Just about every speaker that was talking about, you know, how do you make sure your organisation acts and behaves with integrity, even through the corruption lens, the tone at the top, or the tone from above, as it's sometimes characterised. So the organisational demonstration to commitment to integrity and ethical values starts with the leadership of the organisation. And of course, an indicator of how committed the organisation is to that would be the composition and the effective operation of your audit and risk committees. And that's something that we would look at as external auditors when we're trying to understand what is management's attitude towards internal control. We're also interested in what is management's attitude towards internal audit, towards external audit. And then below that, of course, we like to look at, well, how does management respond to the findings that we make and the findings that internal audit makes, and the recommendations? And does management, senior management, board, chief executives, does management implement the recommendations that it agreed to and undertook to take action on? So the reason I've spent a bit of time on that before I got to the analysis of the thematics, as I said, for those of you who are new to this world, I'd commend this model to you. I think you should get yourself immersed in it as an Audit and Risk Committee member. But also it gives you a way to think about your audit program. And you could, and I suggest you do this when you're understanding your strategic audit plan over the next 3 or 5 years, which hopefully is predicated on a risk assessment, or at least a review of the risk assessments that the organisation's undertaken. So you could imagine that you could have a thematic approach to your auditing. And you know, you could say, well, what are we doing in the operations area in internal audit? What are we doing in the reporting area, and what are we doing in the compliance area? And you could just stream audits through those 3 objectives. But of course, you could take an audit that went across those 3 objectives, and a particular topic could look at operations, the reporting that's associated with the operations, and consider compliance within that if there is significant obligations in terms of regulatory or other compliance. So it's a way to analyse and understand your program. It's also a way to, in fact, to inform the setting up of your program. And you could think about it this way. You could take a particular topic in, say, operational service delivery, and you could ask yourself, in terms of your internal audit scope for that area or that subject matter, are we going to get them just to go and look at the control activities, or are we going to get them to think about the control environment, the risk assessment, the information and communication, and the monitoring? So am I going to take a holistic approach and a slice into that program area that considers the 5 components? And of course, another way to look at it is, well, what I want to do is now look at just risk assessment across the organisation. So again, I think you get the gist. There's a way to analyse and understand your program, but also to inform your program. But to inform that program, you probably need to know, well, where are we most exposed? You know, we can take a generic approach to setting up our internal audit program. So this is what led me to think, well, let's have a look at the recommendations that Vargo's made in its external audit performance reports over the last 5 years. And this is a work in progress, so I just wanted to share it with you. We'll do more work on this, but here's the first kind of headline analysis that we've done. And again, I share it with you so that you might think about doing a similar analysis for yourself in terms of your internal audit findings and recommendations. Unsurprisingly, given I'm analysing here performance audits, most of our recommendations relate to your operations because performance audits are about efficient and effective service delivery. But some of the recommendations do relate to the other two objectives of internal control. And sometimes we actually do specific performance audits, as you're aware, that examine compliance, for example. So that just gives you a sense of where we're focusing our energy and attention in our performance audit program in the operational area. And as I said, well, where's the weight? Where are we focusing most of our findings and our corrective recommendations? And they do centre around, clearly, control activities. So those things that you do within your organisation, the authorisations, the sign-offs, the reconciliations, the checks, the quality checks, the policies and procedures that you've established and communicated to your staff, the weight of our findings and therefore the weight of our recommendations focus on control activities. And so you might say, well, if I'm looking at a particular program, I'll just focus in on the process flow and the activities around that and get some comfort that it's those control activities that management have designed. Well, there's two levels of comfort we're always looking for as external auditors. First, we look at the design of the control activity itself and we step back and ask ourselves, is that control activity or is that combination of controls likely to mitigate the risk that management have identified and created those controls to mitigate? So we look at the design of the control activity first. And of course, if we answer in the negative, well, there's something we communicate back to management and we say we think we've got a mismatch between your internal controls that you've got in place and the risks you're trying to manage. But then more importantly, given that management has designed these control activities and tried to implement them, the other focus is, are they operating as intended? And again, if I reflect on the corruption conference, I think there was not a problem with the design of the controls. The design generally of the internal controls that were subverted in principle was fine. It was the failure of operation of those controls. It was the failure to give effect to management's intent as it went to the internal control activities that created an opportunity for a bad actor to then undertake fraud or get engaged in other corrupt conduct. And of course, that's why we have internal audit, to monitor not just the design, but the operation of internal controls. And if I then break it into the principles that are espoused within those elements, again, under control activities, the selection and development of them and the deployment of them through policies and procedures are the area of most concern to us. So we would be saying in the first 30% there that some of the controls weren't as well designed as they could have been. And then remember, I'm now talking about operational controls rather than financial controls or controls against fraud and corruption. So we see a need to improve the controls over efficient and effective operations. We're doing some analysis, as I said, between the three areas. So I'll just quickly run you through this in terms of the first cut analysis we've got. Again, the major focus, set of our recommendations was on operations. And again, this is just reiterating, I'm now sounding like a broken record. It's in the control area, control activity area, that we see most of the problems. And here's some of the thematics. So what we'll do with this is when we finally finish this analysis and this product, we'll do a thematic of the types of things we're finding and the recommendations we're making, and we'll match them against this control framework. So that's the whole intent of this analysis. Reporting. Now this is interesting, and it's, I guess again, maybe my talk today is really influenced by what I heard over the last 2 days. But in the reporting space, it wasn't so much that there's not good controls. I mean, let's face it, we've got fairly well established financial reporting processes, fairly mature and sophisticated financial reporting and performance reporting processes. But where we find problems is the content of what's communicated. I guess the third dot point on this slide is something that was a feature over the last 2 days and something that I get concerned about when I look at my performance audit reports. And it goes to this quality of advice that goes to ministers and other government agencies. And I'm not sure this is an area that audit and risk committees focus on. And that's why I'm suggesting to you, when you're looking at your program, you should look at all the elements of control and all the objectives of control and ask yourself, how well is the agency providing information to decision makers, for example, ministers, in the context of its own operations? And the words full and frank advice appear quite often, and we've been concerned over my time, and I know with previous Auditors-General, that the public service isn't always giving full and frank advice. Now, that's a big thing to unpack, of course. I'm not going to try and unpack it today, but as we write our analysis of the thematics, there'll probably be some more discussion of that. But I just reiterate that because I'm interested in whether or not the audit and risk committees, in framing their internal audit programs, see it within their purview to look at the communication with the executive government, and whether or not public servants are doing their job. As you know, there's new BPSC guidelines have just been promulgated on this, about the role of the public service in giving advice to ministers, and particularly giving advice that might not be welcomed. Something for you to consider as audit and risk committee members. I'll move more quickly now. Compliance, so it's the same. We're just doing this analysis. This area was really in the monitoring, conducts ongoing and separate evaluations. So, we understand our compliance requirements, but to what extent are we monitoring those compliance requirements to ensure that we're actually compliant? And again, here's some of the thematics from those performance audits. Okay, that was a quick run through. I hope you found that useful. I'm happy to take any questions that may occur. I'll stop sharing that, I think, now. Right, okay. I'm just checking the Q&A. Oh, okay, right, what's this? Right, I might leave that. I've got one question. No, I've got one question which is about committee meetings, but I think we can leave that to the end in the general plenary. But for those of you who are online, as I said, please use the Q&A function. This is an opportunity while we're meeting virtually and remotely, at least to understand your concerns. And if there's anything you need us to clarify, we're available to try and answer those questions today. Right, well, I'm not seeing any new questions come online. So I think what I'll do now is hand over to Roberta Skliros, who's the Assistant Auditor-General Financial Audit, as I said, and Roberta will take you through the results of our audit of the annual financial report of the State of Victoria. Thanks, Roberta.
Thanks, Andrew. It's lovely to be with you all today at our second Audit Committee live event for the year. Andrew and I thought it'd be a really good opportunity to present to you on our report of the state's AFR, as it's a key output relating to many of the audits that we undertake and that many of you are involved with. And we will look to present on our report covering the local government sector at our first live event next year. But before I walk through our presentation around our report on the state's AFR, I did just want to acknowledge the financial reporting and audit cycle that's just passed, or in some cases that's still going on at present. You may recall that at the June live event, for those of you that attended, that I highlighted the consequential impacts faced by the pandemic, disrupting our operations in financial audit, that of our service providers and also of the public sector clients we audit. Examples of those challenges related to skilled labour shortages, aggressive recruitment strategies in the accounting industry, fatigue and illness, in addition to the tight timeframes relating to the state election. This disruption has continued over the course of our year-end cycle. My staff, ASPs, and many of our clients have been in a constant state of workforce planning to ensure that we align our resources where we need it the most and focus our efforts on what's of greatest priority. So this has meant that in some instances, financial report preparation by our clients and the subsequent audit processes have occurred later than what we would have seen pre the pandemic. And it's not ideal, we know that, but it's the reality that we've all collectively experienced. A week or so ago, I had the opportunity to spend some time with the heads of financial audit of all the other state and territory offices around Australia. And all the officers and their respective client bases have continued to face similar challenges to what we are in terms of prolonged reporting cycles and workforce retention issues. And it was really clear from engaging with them that the challenges around workforce planning and sourcing will continue to occur across the accounting industry for quite some time, and it's just going to require our collective and constant focus. We're seeing from the last 3 years, of financial reporting and audit cycles, fatigue in the finance division of the clients we audit, and also of our audit workforces at Vargo and our service providers. And we know that the workforce need a break, and there are limited options in the market to supplement this leave at the moment. So this may mean that moving into 2023 that we'll have some bumps along the way and we might see some delays in processes again. These challenges that we're facing extend beyond the accounting professionals in the public sector also. We're not alone, or we're not unique here in terms of workforce retention challenges. Like the last few years, again, I'll call to arms to everyone that this situation requires all of us collectively, being auditors and our clients, to approach the next cycle with a shared understanding, with flexibility, and just to keep the lines of communication open so that we can manage any of the bumps along the way as best as we can. Okay, I'll jump on to our report on the state's annual financial report for 21-22. I thought I'd start the presentation with giving you just a little bit of context around what the state's annual report is and why we undertake a report on it. The state's annual financial report, or the AFR, which I'll refer to it now, presents the financial report of the state of Victoria and the general government sector. The state of Victoria consists of 3 sectors that you can see on this slide. So the general government sector includes entities that are economically dependent on government, and they provide goods and services at below or no cost, such as our departments or portfolio agencies like hospitals. We've got the public non-financial corporation sector, which includes agencies that provide goods or services operating on a cost recovery basis, for example, like our regional water corps or our cemeteries in the public sector. And then finally, the public financial corporations, which are all our agencies that deal with financial service aspects of the state, such as our insurers or the Treasury Corp of Victoria. The state's AFR is a consolidation of approximately 280 controlled entities across these 3 sectors. And each year, the government's required to prepare the consolidated financial report, and we're required to come along and audit it, in addition to auditing all the individual agencies that fall within the state's control. The AFR only includes agencies that are deemed state-controlled agencies for financial reporting purposes. There are other public sector agencies that we audit that aren't captured here because the state doesn't control them. These are entities like local councils, universities, denomination hospitals, and our registered community health centres. So why do we undertake a parliamentary report on the state's AFR? To put simply, it's a requirement of our Audit Act. The Auditor-General must provide a report to Parliament every year on the state's AFR, and it's to cover areas that Andrew sees or judges as significant and that arise from the audit of the AFR or the entities that fall within the consolidation, and that relate to either the effective and efficient management of public resources or in the keeping of proper accounts and records. The Act requires us to report this by the 24th of November each year, but as a result of the state election and the caretaker mode occurring at the end of October, we prepared and transmitted this report earlier this year on the 28th of October. Because of this reduced timing, our report looks a little bit different to the past, where it only contains audit and financial outcomes of the state. It doesn't contain an analysis of keeping of the proper accounts and records that you usually see in our reports each year. And we are currently considering whether we do a follow-up report in that space early next year. And we'll let you know if that's the case. The report. This year, we issued a clear opinion on the AFR again, meaning that the information in the report is reliable and Parliament and the Victorian community can have confidence in the report's content. The general government sector reported a net operating loss of $13.8 billion and net operating cash outflows of $8.9 billion. The state reported a net operating loss of $15.3 billion and net operating cash outflows of $4.8 billion. And these results continue to be adversely affected by the government's response to the pandemic. To form our opinion on the AFR, we focus our attention on the transactions and balances of 28 state-controlled entities that make up the majority of the total state's revenue, expenditure, assets and liabilities, and we call these material entities. We prioritise the completion of these audits so that government can meet its own legislative date for tabling the AFR by the 15th of October. This year, we worked with these material entities with best endeavours to ensure they could finalise their audits and table their financial reports in Parliament by the last sitting day toward the back end of September in the lead up to the state's election. We issued clear opinions on the financial statements of 25 of these entities, and except for the Department of Treasury and Finance, we were able to issue opinions for the completed audits by the 12th of September, so in advance of that Parliament's last sitting day. We issued an adverse opinion on VicTrack's financial report for the third year in a row, but DTF made essential adjustment to make sure the errors of VicTrack did not flow through to the state's AFR, and I'll touch on this again in a few slides. We're yet to provide an opinion on the Department of Jobs, Precincts, Regions and the North East Link State Tolling Corporation, but we've completed enough work at these entities to conclude that there was not a material risk to impact our opinion on the AFR. And I'll cover a little bit more detail on these three material entity audit matters over the next couple of slides. VicTrack is the legal custodian of the state's transport-related assets, which are valued at about $41 billion. It leases the majority of these assets to the Department of Transport, which then provides the operators of the train, tram and regional transport networks access for them to be able to run transport services to the Victorian community. We issued an adverse opinion on VicTrack's financial report again this year because in our view, it continues to incorrectly account for the assets it leases to the department as an operating lease and not a finance lease. The qualification did not affect our opinion on the AFR, as I mentioned previously, because a central adjustment was made on consolidation of all of those entities to correct the accounting treatment by DTF. This year, DJPR paid $7.6 billion in grants to support individuals and businesses affected by the pandemic. The department received a large volume of grant applications for multiple support programs, all with varied eligibility criteria and conditions. Processing these grant applications occurred, as you can imagine, in a challenging environment, given the increased pressure of the pandemic and the need to balance processes against distribution of much needed financial support for the Victorian community. Similar to last year, we continued to identify significant control deficiencies supporting the validity and accuracy of the grant payments, which meant we couldn't rely on the control framework around the grant program and had to perform alternative audit procedures. This testing was the only work outstanding at the department at the time of finalising our audit of the AFR, and based on the work that we'd undertaken to that point, we were able to conclude that there was not a material risk to the AFR to prevent us signing an opinion on the state's AFR. North East Link State Tolling Corporation is responsible for delivering the North East Link Road project. Although the audit of the corporation is not complete, we satisfactorily tested $20.1 billion project commitment that's included in the financial statements, which is reported in the note to the financial statements of the AFR before we issued the opinion. Our report focuses on the general government sector because it's this sector of government whose financial results make up the most of the state's consolidated results, and also because the government assesses its performance based on this sector's results. Our analysis is also structured around some key financial measures in addition to the state's measures to aid in interpreting the financial outcomes of the state. The state budget of Victoria sets out the government's long-term financial management objectives for the general government sector and the key financial measures and targets to achieve them. And this slide here contains those measures and the targets and the results for 21-22. The measures and targets were amended in the 2021 year to reflect the government's focus on economic recovery and longer-term financial management after the pandemic. They are now, in terms of the targets, more qualitative rather than quantitative to allow for greater flexibility in times of this economic and fiscal uncertainty that we're experiencing. In our report, we provide analysis on some additional financial measures that we believe provide further insight into the financial outcomes of the state, being the general government sector debt to revenue ratios and also the operating result, which I'll touch on briefly now. Borrowings for the general government sector increased by $24.6 billion during the year to nearly $118 billion at 30 June. And the government used these increased borrowings to fund infrastructure investment and to also finance the operating cash deficit of $8.9 million. To service this debt, so that's to pay annual interest costs and also repay principal, the government needs to generate operating and cash surpluses. And while it's in deficit, the debt will continue to grow. Net debt as a percentage of economic activity, which is indicated by gross state product, and also gross debt as a percentage of operating revenue are both measures of longer term sustainability as they indicate a government's ability to service its debt. Net debt to GSP is one of the financial measures used by the government to assess indebtedness. In our report, we also analyse gross debt to public sector revenue as we consider this another useful measure to understand indebtedness. This graph shows the ratio of GGS gross debt to revenue in the dark green colour. It's grown from its previous trend of around 60% to about 144% this year. And the state budget estimates its growth to reach nearly 222% in 2026. The increase in the ratio reflects both the need to fund operating cash deficits in response to the pandemic and also of the increased, the government's planned increase to their infrastructure program. This rate of growth is slightly above the rate of growth in the net debt to GSP ratio seen via the light green line on the graph below. The net operating result is another key measure of financial performance and operating sustainability. And as we all know, an operating surplus indicates sound financial performance. The government's response to the COVID pandemic continued to adversely impact the financial performance of the state this year. And as a result, the general government sector reported a net operating loss of $13.8 billion. This was an improvement of $770 million compared to last year, but $2.2 billion worse than budgeted. The government forecasts that the operating deficit will reduce over the next 3 years before returning to a surplus in 2026. To achieve this, it's necessary for the government to manage its own operating expenditure, over which we believe it has greater control compared to its revenue base. Several risks exist that could adversely impact the financial performance of the GGS and therefore the achievement of these estimated results out to 2026. We highlight 3 of these in our report around expenditure growth, the risk to the state's large capital works program, and also the performance of the work cover scheme. I'll take you through these risks briefly across the next few slides. Expenditure growth. So to achieve its short-term and medium-term financial objectives, the government will need to ensure that the GGS rate of growth in recurrent expenditure falls and stays below revenue growth. And as you can see from this graph, this was not the case in the 5 years up to 2021. After a 2019 review of general government expenditure, the government determined that departments needed to achieve cost savings of about $2.4 billion across 4 years from 21-22 and $960 million each year thereafter. This was in addition to efficiency dividends announced last year that required departments to achieve a further $1.9 billion in savings over the same period. Employee costs are the state's largest single operating expense, and government determined that workforce reductions were required to achieve these cost savings. Targeted FTE reductions at departments of approximately 3,100 in 21-22 and a further 1,500 in the following year were identified and assumed in the 21-22 state budget. From our review of employee numbers that are or will be reported in the 9 departmental annual reports, found that a collective net reduction of only 393 FTE was achieved in 21-22. Any significant delays in achieving these targeted FTE reductions put at risk the timing of the GGS returning to cash and operating surpluses. The second risk we comment on in our report relates to the state's significant infrastructure program. The government continues to borrow to fund capital projects, and over the next 4 years, it plans to spend an average of $21.3 billion a year on infrastructure. In our second major projects performance report released in September, and I've popped the link on the slide if you're interested in taking a look at that report, we found that the cost of 2/3 of projects we reviewed had changed compared to the first public budget. The net impact of these changes was an increase in costs of $11.2 billion, and this compares to a previous year when we reported an increase of budgeted costs of about $4.9 billion. If adverse cost outcomes continue, further additional unplanned debt will occur, or the announced capital program may need to be refined. The last risk we comment on in our report relates to the performance of the work cover scheme. The value of the provision for WorkSafe insurance claims has almost doubled over the last 6 years. In our report last year, we noted that an independent review of the financial sustainability of the scheme occurred in 2021 and concluded that the current financial trajectory was unsustainable. Financial challenges continued in 21-22, and WorkSafe expects these challenges to continue next year and beyond. The government provided WorkSafe $450 million during the year to support its financial position over the short term, and that in addition to $550 million provided the year before. As a result of the financial pressures on the scheme and the subsequent outlook, WorkSafe have developed a capital response plan to outline the required actions to address the financial performance challenges. And these suggested actions are on this slide, and there's further detail in our report. I wanted to end the presentation on the report with making you aware of our dashboard that captures the underlying data of the state's AFR, and it really complements our report. You can find this on our website, and I've popped the link at the base of the presentation slide today. The dashboard graphically presents the general government sector financial information, the state budget, and also the financial ratios that I spoke of. You can drill down into the composition of each balance and apply multiple filters, including looking at actual and budget results. And the financial data sets go back to 2016-17, and they're projected out to the most recent estimates from the budget tabled earlier this year. Sharing this with you as you may have interest in having a little play when you have some time. That brings me to the end of my presentation today. If you have any questions on the report, happy to take them now, or if things pop up in your mind post the event, please feel free to touch base with myself or Tim Maxfield, who's Sector Director of our whole of government team. Andrew, I'll just see if there are any questions.
Not a specific question on the presentation, Roberta, so I'm happy to go straight into and answer the more general questions.
Sure thing.
So as I run through, where will I start? Okay, well, let's start with some practical. Will we circulate the presentations after the session? Absolutely. And I believe it's also recorded, so it should be available as a video through our website, or we'll certainly send links to it. So that's one of the first practical ones. If I reflect on Roberta's presentation, before I get and answer some of these other questions, but one of them is relevant as it goes to risk management. I'd recommend you have a look at the AFR report in terms of your role as a committee member on your particular agencies, to think about these broader sectoral context and these issues that are associated with particularly the general government sector. And the three things that occurred to me through the presentation. Clearly, you know, we've got some problems with spending in Victoria. That's evident through the operating deficits and the fiscal deficits, particularly because we've got a very ambitious capital program. And associated with that, we've now got this idea of workforce reduction. And workforce reduction in and of itself isn't not necessarily a bad thing, but really it's how it's rolled out. And I wonder, as Audit and Risk Committee members, whether or not it's even an audit that may be done, which would be to work with management about how did you approach the savings ask of you on top of the efficiency dividends. Where have you determined to make the workforce reductions? Are they the places you should be making the workforce reductions? And are they being managed so that internal control is not compromised? You know, we hear about the hollowing out of the public sector, the over-reliance on consultants, the lack of corporate and core knowledge. So these things concern me as an Auditor-General. Certainly when my financial auditors go through an organisation, one of the things we ask ourselves is about the skills and competence of the workforce, and particularly, and we know we're all challenged these days in the finance areas, trying to get people who do have that knowledge and skill that we require. So that is a concern for me, and how is it impacting on my control environment and my control activities. And then, you know, we talked about the grants program at DJPR, and not to signal them out at all, but more broadly with grants programs, and you've seen this through reporting in other jurisdictions. You know, that's an area that's kind of open to, if you want to call it, corruption or maladministration, mismanagement. And then you overlay that, of course, with the urgency and the emergency over the last 2 or 3 years in terms of rolling grants out the door. And something that I've said publicly many times and privately to all the secretaries of departments is that we understand that there's a balance here, and that we understand that there's a risk in terms of getting money out the door, that you'll be paying money to people who shouldn't be getting it. But that's okay in a short-term sense because of the urgency and the emergency. So what I talk about is you set up a grants program with a high trust front end, where you're pretty much trusting the people to be honest when they apply for the grant, but you can't just leave it with the high trust front end. You then need to come in after the event, post-payment, and determine and try to understand to what extent you made payments to people who weren't entitled to them. So I always like to see that second part of the equation. One of the challenges, of course, is, and now overlay this with the expenditure ask, the reduction in expenditure asked by agencies, is that kind of post-payment checking even funded? You know, it certainly wouldn't be necessarily contemplated within the cost of the grants program. So how does a secretary obtain the resources to do that work after the event, given all the other competing priorities of the organisation, and competing priorities in terms of their resources and their focus? So these are the types of things from that broader AFR report. The capital program, I know in local government, it's a perennial problem managing and delivering the annual capital program. And so that's an area to me of risk, particularly as it goes to managing scope and cost overruns. Right, okay, some of the questions. I'm trying to facilitate them in a logical, orderly way. Right, okay, we'll start with this. As I said, I mentioned there's a question about the internal control framework, and yes, it is a long established framework and it has not been reviewed, which could be an indication, of course, that it stands the test of time and therefore that it can't be improved upon. But the observation of one of the questioners here, Greg, is that one of the key things that a lot of organisations are doing is reviewing their risk management culture, as this has a direct impact on overall control framework. I agree that that's a really important part of the overall control framework. Is VARGO considering looking at this as part of their performance audits in the future, and as it would provide considerable value? And so the answer to that is I don't have a particular intent at the moment in my annual plan to do an audit which just looks at risk management per se within the public sector, although I'm certainly open to that suggestion. And we're in the middle of our annual planning process again this year, so if we get some indications that that's an area that needs to be examined, we certainly will have regard to it. What we typically do in a performance audit, and it goes back to that COSO model, is when the auditors are understanding the subject matter of the area that we want to audit, one of the things they do look at is the risk management as it relates to that subject matter. Now, of course, that's down at a program or a service delivery level and doesn't necessarily step back and consider the entire organisational risk management culture, but it certainly gives us a window into risk management culture. But I'll certainly take that suggestion on board, and I'll talk to my strategic audit planning people about their thoughts about doing some work in the risk management space. What else have we got? Given these challenges, will your future performance audits consider the capacity of agencies to staff services given service delivery expectations? It's kind of a double-edged sword, the idea of the ability of agencies to staff the services. And as I said, one thing I'm interested in is when cuts are made, what's been the logic behind that? How has the organisation approached systematically considering where it might be able to make staff reductions? And have they done that with kind of a risk overlay? But there's another side of the coin, and quite often in our performance audits, when we talk to the areas and to the organisation, they say to us, look, well, we just don't have enough resources in this area to do what we'd like to do. And Auditor-General, will you please recommend that we get more funding? Now, I'm kind of open to that, but I also, my challenge back to the people saying that, it's a little bit circular, but I think it's worth posing the question, and your internal auditors could pose the same question. Can you demonstrate to me at the moment that with the resources you've got, you're as efficient and as effective as you can be? And therefore we are certain that it's about a lack of resources, is the first question I ask of the program area. And then at the higher level in the organisation, it's about the total fund of the organisation and where are they directing their resources. So instead of going and asking for more money from outside the organisation, is there a reprioritisation and redirection within the organisation? So how do you consider all your services? And I know I've been having a conversation with the council about this recently, about going back and understanding their revenue and expenditure policies, which are tied to their service delivery, understanding the services they're providing, why they're providing them, the quality of the services, for example, those service level standards, and questioning, do we need to provide this service? What's the level of service we need to provide? So coming back again to answering the question, where we need to be satisfied that we're as efficient and effective as we can be before we go and ask for more money. We'll move on to the roles of audit committees. Someone's made an observation that at least in rural health services, that their induction program doesn't do enough around, it's fairly broad, which is fine, but they'd appreciate more support in the audit risk area, and I'd certainly support that. VARGO stands ready, particularly through our sector directors in financial audit and our performance audit sector directors, to go out and engage directly with boards and audit and risk committees individually and also collectively. And I guess this is an opportunity through these presentations to share some of that that update, that insight that we can give you. Just let me see what's next. Right, okay, now there's some questions about the office, my office. And one of the first questions is, they've seen that we've been advertising a new Assistant Auditor-General performance audit. We have been. How's the search going? I'll find out next week when they present me with a shortlist. I'm hoping. It's a tough space to find the people you need to deliver your program, but I'm optimistic that we'll get a good shortlist. Our intent is to have appointed the new Assistant Auditor-General in Performance Audit early next year. And within the organisation, we're reviewing how we're doing performance audit and the structure and how we deliver performance audits. So I want a new AAG to come in and have input to that and then roll out any changes we may make internally. And the other question I noted on my organisation, someone's noted that we did recently publish a paper on independence, and it was the independence, but it wasn't generally about independence of the Auditor-General, the IBAC Commissioner and the Ombudsman, the three independent officers of Parliament who have an integrity function. It was specifically focused on our funding. And this is kind of as I said, it says in the forward, an issue du jour in just about every jurisdiction. How do we fund integrity agencies? And the whole idea of the paper was to consider other jurisdictional models about how the three organisations are funded, effectively to take the politics out of it and to get some comfort that the funding levels are appropriate for the roles and responsibilities of those three agencies within the general constraints, the fiscal constraints of the particular jurisdictions. So that was the intent of that paper, just to really start a debate and a discussion about how Victoria might be able to model some of the other jurisdictions like the ACT and New Zealand, which have different approaches to monitoring, oversighting and setting the budgets of our three agencies. Is this the first time we've done this? On funding specifically, yes, but I do recall at least 10 years ago that there was a joint paper put out. There wasn't an IBAC then, but by the Ombudsman and the Auditor-General, talking about independence and strengthening the independence of our organisations. I'll ask Roberta a question so that I can look at all the other Q&As. So here's one for you, Roberta. When can we expect your local government report?
The team are currently working on compiling that report currently. If Parliament rises in December, we're hoping to transmit the report ahead of Christmas, but if not, it will be early in the new year. And we are planning to prepare the short condensed report again this year, consistent with last year. We received some really good feedback around the ease of consumption of the key insights and messages there. But if anyone has any further feedback on the way in which we've restructured the report, I'm open to that, and also to what we're presenting on our dashboard on the website. Just reach out. It would be good to sort of hear your views on that product.
Thanks, Roberta. Okay, on the risk theme, someone's noted that the VMIA, for those of you clients of the VMIA, have a great risk maturity tool that they can make available to their clients. And this person's observed that it's very helpful for Audit and Risk Committee members to understand the risk management position of the organisation. Do we know of any other risk maturity tools that are available? Not off the top of my head, but there is a lot of work I saw again through this anti-corruption conference, focused on maturity models and risk management, and the lens for this particular issue is about corruption, but really just applies across anything you want to think about in terms of your organisation, efficient and effective operations. So there are a number of maturity model tools that are being developed by the Australian public sector, the Public Service Commission up there, which goes through risk assessment in the context of integrity, and has a series of maturity models or maturity levels. And I think something like that could be adapted and adopted to considering risk management, as I said, for anything in the organisation, not just integrity and corruption. So I'd probably draw your attention to that up on the Australian government websites, the Public Service Commission up there. I think I've just about got to all the questions rather than just some commentary. Oh, okay. No, here's one. This is a really important question, as they all are. Who should develop and approve the detailed scope of an internal audit? The audit committee or management? Well, that's quite, I mean, and it depends what you mean by the detailed scope, so clearly the audit committee, depending on, the construct of your organisation, whether you're a member of a board audit committee or whether you're supporting a secretary or a chief executive officer in a corporation sole, the audit committee is charged with oversighting internal audit and giving comfort to the governing body that internal control is exercised effectively in the organisation. So the audit committee must have a role in setting the program, absolutely, but not just setting the program in terms of the topic itself, but then considerations within the topic, as I've said, about, well, which elements of the internal control structure we're going to look at within this topic. And are we looking across the board, as the comment was, about risk management across the organisation? Is that an area? So I think at what I'd call the topic strategy level, we call it the audit strategy level, those strategic considerations, what will be the objective of this review, what will be the scope of this review, what will be the approach to this review, will be a systems approach, will be a problem approach, are we focused on efficiency and effectiveness, are we focused on compliance? All those matters to me are a matter for the Audit and Risk Committee. They should be satisfied against the risk analysis that's been done to inform that program that the internal audits do respond to the risk that's been identified, that the objective actually is something that was the intent that came out of the risk assessment. If I then take it from what I'd call the audit strategy down to the detailed audit plan, and before I get there, I guess I should comment that you would never develop that audit strategy without talking to management. So I think it's a process of communication and discussion, both with management to inform and get an understanding of what's happening on the ground, and then taking that back to the audit committee. When you get down to the very granular detailed audit plan, I guess I'm less concerned about how much involvement the committee has. I think this committee should see the detailed plan. And again, it's just this idea of consistency and flow. But you want to know that the actual work program that's going to be delivered and executed is aligned with the audit strategy and the intent of the audit committee in terms of their obligation to give comfort to the governing body about the operation of internal control. I hope that's answered the question for you. But as always, with all these questions and the offer that Roberta made, we're more than happy to talk with you one-on-one, not just myself and Roberta, but the directors who oversight your portfolio. More than happy to engage with you individually as committee members, and please feel free to reach out and talk to us about that. The last point I wanted to make, and I know we're starting to run out of time, it was the first question, but I've left it till last at this stage. The observation is that, we're getting into hybrid work. It's become a permanent part of our lives. A lot of speculation. You'll never get all your staff back into the office all the time ever again. So this is just a feature of how we work these days. But because we can't come together, and here's an example today, because we can't come together physically in a room, and we lose that ability to, read body language and look at people's reactions and whatever, and we're not getting that immediate feedback, it's then harder through a hybrid. I think it's even harder through a hybrid process. If we're all online, well, we can see each other. We can actually, we can eyeball each other, at least virtually. If half of us are online or a couple of us are online and the rest of us are sitting in a room, it can be problematic if you particularly, and I'm now thinking in the context of audit and risk committees, because, we quite often now virtually attend your committee meetings, as maybe do your internal auditors, as maybe do some of your members. So the approach we adopt in Vargo, just for your consideration, is every time we have a hybrid meeting, we ask everybody to basically bring their laptops, so those who come together physically, to bring their laptops with them and actually to join the session virtually, even though they're all sitting in the room together. And the idea of that is to give that equity and equality of experience to all those participating. Because, you know, again, we were talking about integrity risks over the conference for the last 2 days, and discussions about how can boards be effective, and, you know, why do we make bad decisions, and when do we make bad decisions? And, you know, there's these cognitive biases, and there's the recency effect where the last person who spoke, well, they, you know, I'll pay more attention to that because they were the last person who spoke, or the primacy effect. Well, the person who opens the meeting, I'll have more regard to them, and I'll discount what other people say. So we've got to be aware of these kind of, you know, psychological and cognitive biases about the way we interact with people. And I think a good way to avoid that and overcome that, at least, is to have everybody have a common experience in the way they engage and participate in your audit and risk committees. Right. I'm not sure if there are any other questions. We've got a few more minutes. With COVID, internal auditing became an off-site process necessary due to lockdowns. Now we're able to move again. There appears to be a shift in the internal auditors want to keep this going. My thoughts are that they need to be on site to get a pulse of the organisation. What are your thoughts? Yeah, well, you know what, I'm an old-fashioned auditor. I've been around a long time, so I'm probably biased here, and I tend to agree with that sentiment. You know, I was talking to someone yesterday who wants to come and work in the organisation, and explaining how we approach our audits. Now, in my world, I think it's really hard, particularly in a performance audit space, to do an audit remotely if you can't go out there and actually physically observe, you know, the systems, the processes, the context within which the operations are being delivered. So I'm a fan of site visits, and if I then translate that to financial audit, I'm kind of pro having my auditors go out there. I don't think we need to go out there as often as we used to and sit ourselves physically out there. We did that because we had to physically be out there, because we couldn't access information remotely, because the technology like this didn't exist at the time. But I don't think we should be going 100% the other way. You know, and I would encourage and I always encourage my auditors, and I know Roberta would too, to be doing site visits and having those conversations. It's all about why you're going out there and the quality of the conversation you're having. Within our own organisation, we've got kind of a matrix model about when will we work alone, and when will we work together, and when will we work together alone and alone together. So there's, you know, there's kind of 4 quadrants. And we find that, you know, you come together to collaborate and to share information efficiently and effectively, you know, particularly if you're trying to brainstorm or whatever. But there's opportunity to work, you know, alone, where you just need to do some focused work, analyse some financial information, for example. So it's neither one nor the other, but I'm a bit of a fan of getting out on site. Of course, there are considerations with that in this new world of COVID, where we need to be aware of the COVID stance posture of those organisations that we might visit, and they may in fact have constraints on people, and of course there may be constraints on the auditors, particularly if they're immunocompromised, not being able to put themselves in higher risk situations. So it's not an easy answer, I don't think. But as I said, generally, I'm kind of for people, auditors, internal auditors and external auditors and evaluators and consultants getting out there and eyeballing people in real life. Okay, I've got no more questions that I can see. I might have just lost all my list of questions, so I'm not sure what's happened there. But hopefully we've answered your questions. Thank you for those who made observations as well throughout, and thank you for those who've commended the presentation and the idea of these presentations. It encourages us to continue to do them. As I said initially, We started off doing these as a once a year event, face to face. We've been mugged by COVID, and we went to hybrid online, and we were doing them once a year. I think the idea that we do them twice a year is probably at least the right thing, and shorter, sharper presentations so that we're not eating too much into your day given your busy schedules. So with that, I'm now going to draw it to a close. Thank you for attending. As I said, the slides will be made available. We'll probably do some outreach to you after this. We'll certainly want to understand, get your feedback on the presentations themselves, the format, and what I'm always interested in, of course, is topic ideas. What would you like us to be talking to you about? So I would really appreciate through our outreach to you after this, if you could give us some suggestions for what we might bring to the next forum, which should be around about March next year. So I wish you all the best, and thank you all for attending.